Wednesday, October 19th. Tonight on The National, Great Lakes promise. Mulrooney pledges more money to clean up the pollution. Bomb at the border. A devastating explosion kills Israeli soldiers inside Lebanon. And on the Journal, rescue at sea. The race against time to save the whales trapped in the ice. Tonight, from Barrow, Alaska, why their drama has caught everyone's attention. The National with Sheldon Turcott.
Good evening. For Prime Minister Mulrooney, this was Environment Day. He described the evils of pollution and promised to do something about it. Specifically, he promised to clean up the Great Lakes. But as Wendy Mesley reports, some environmentalists are skeptical of Mulrooney's sincerity.
It's the biggest promise of Brian Mulrooney's campaign so far. With a federally funded research center in Burlington as a backdrop, the Conservative leader promised to spend an extra $125 million over 5 years to clean up the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Basin. That would double the amount of federal money spent now. But this group of environmentalists was not impressed. Greenpeace says if Mulrooney really cared about the issue, he had lots of time to prove it. They say he has no right to call himself an environmentalist now.
I don't think so, and I think that I'm speaking for thousands of other people who believe that that is a very popular opinion these days, and that's all it is. He's on the right side of public opinion.
Later, in a speech to the Rotary Club in Hamilton, Mulrooney made another environmental promise, to sign a treaty with the United States on cutting acid rain. He said he's the only Canadian leader the Americans would sign one with.
You don't get there through the shrillness of your voice, nor do you reach an agreement in one area of a relationship while you are tearing up agreements in another.
Environmental issues are not only popular. Polls show Canadians think it's one area where the Mulrooney government let them down. So now Mulrooney is promising to spend an extra $125 million. And his communications staff says there'll be more soon. Wendy Mesley, CBC News, Hamilton, Ontario.
The NDP leader, Ed Broadbent, is the first party leader to take this election campaign to Canada's north. The locale was new, but not Broadbent's message. He said free trade would be bad for Canada, particularly bad for the north. But as Anna Maria Tremonti reports, Broadbent heard some dissenting views.
A few women were busy sewing at this Whitehorse parka plant as Ed Broadbent strolled through on a guided tour this morning.
I love the shades, eh?
But as Broadbent watched the workers, the company vice president was telling reporters how difficult it is to ship his goods across the border to Alaska.
I guess so. Just going through customs, that's what makes it all the time. You have to, everything has to be itemized, and it just takes so long.
Burkle says he's willing to give free trade a try. Last night, demonstrators in favor of free trade carried their placards to the lodge where Broadbent was to speak.
Canadians are competitive enough that we can compete with anyone, including the Americans.
I think they're trying to scare people into, voting against the free trade deal.
They were so busy explaining their views to reporters, they missed Broadbent's arrival.
Hey! How you doing?
Late this afternoon, Broadbent switched gears, arriving in Yellowknife to tour a community daycare center. Broadbent pledged $25 million to pay for special daycare needs.
It is clear that child care needs are different here from the situation in fishing outports in Newfoundland or downtown Montreal.
The NDP has already promised to create 200,000 daycare spaces within 4 years. This latest promise brings their total daycare spending to $2.5 billion. Anna Maria Tremonti, CBC News, Yellowknife.
It was a feisty John Turner campaigning today at the University of British Columbia. Several people in his audience were openly hostile, but the hostility only seemed to make Turner stronger. Keith Bogue reports.
It was the young liberals at the University of British Columbia who invited Turner here, but it was by no means a solidly liberal audience which turned out to meet him. From the outset, there was a verbal pitched battle between Turner supporters and other students in favor of free trade.
In other words, well...
Turner usually enjoys these question and answer sessions with students, but this time he was heckled and he hit back.
So far in this election, we've had images and polls and market surveys and what are the code words that are going to tempt Canadians to vote for you. I have been dealing with the one issue that counts, the future of my country, and I want you to think about it.
The more the heckling continued, the smoother and more confident Turner appeared.
We happen to think that Canadians are now mature enough and that we're skillful enough and that we're resourceful enough, and that we're tough enough that we can make our own decisions for our own choices, for our own future, in our own way. That's what
it was arguably the best performance Turner has given since the campaign began. He fought off most of the heckling about free trade. But as he left the hall, he was followed by taunts that the Liberal Party is headed for oblivion.
After the election, there will be no two-party system.
In spite of his strong performance today, Turner still has to deal with problems within his own campaign team. From the beginning, he has dodged questions about his policy on abortion, even though some of his closest advisors talk openly with reporters about it. And there are divisions within the party itself about whether he should even announce a policy on abortion in this campaign. The question has to be resolved soon because Turner will certainly face it during the televised leaders' debate next week. Keith Bogue, CBC News, Vancouver.
The Liberals' division on abortion is just one part of a much bigger problem. For the last several days, there's been some astonishing maneuvering at the highest levels of the party. Some of the most senior people in the party thought the unthinkable. Deep into this election campaign, they thought about putting pressure on John Turner to quit. But CBC News has learned they've pulled back and are now prepared to work to salvage the campaign. Our chief correspondent, Peter Mansbridge, has the story of a party in crisis.
Last Thursday, 4 top Liberal strategists met at party headquarters in Ottawa. Michael Kirby, John Webster, Al Graham, and Andre Ouellette met to discuss just how poorly the Liberal campaign was going. They talked about a lot of things: the polls, the ridings where they couldn't get candidates, the poor image of the leader, even the impact of an immediate change in leadership. The next day, all 4 men signed documents outlining the desperate situation the party was in and sent them to John Turner at the Liberal leader's official residence, Stornoway. They did not include their thoughts about leadership, but they did ask to see Turner in a face-to-face meeting. At Stornoway, Turner read the briefing, but remained resolute, convinced the campaign was still winnable, even if he had to do it alone. He refused to meet the strategists. The next day, Saturday, Turner talked to some of them by phone, leaving them convinced he would not step down. The strategists decided a leadership change was not an option any longer, and others impressed upon them that the campaign must go on, that dissent must end. But then Sunday night, the CBC poll results, especially the leadership questions where Turner ranked dead last on every one of 10 different qualities. A frenzied series of cross-country phone calls took place by strategists and senior Liberal candidates trying to assess the damage and the options. 5 of the candidates, Turner's front bench in the House of Commons, called for a crisis meeting with Turner. Herb Gray from Windsor, Lloyd Axworthy from Winnipeg, Bob Kaplan from Toronto, Andre Ouellette, who'd been in the strategist meeting, and Raymond Garneau from Quebec. By late Monday, Gray put in the request by phone for a meeting with Turner, but he was blocked by Principal Secretary Peter Connolly. Connolly was determined not to allow Turner to get into these kind of discussions until he comes back to Ottawa later this week. It's not clear yet what the 5 MPs wanted to tell Turner, but it is known that asking Turner to step aside had been discussed by some of the group. But some also felt that if Turner was forced out, the party could be left in ruins by a very public bloodbath. For the next 2 days, right up until late this afternoon, there was confusion and chaos. The senior aides with Turner on the campaign trail would not talk to senior strategists and candidates on the ground. Connolly didn't know who to trust anymore. All this follows an incredible 4-week period inside the most senior levels of the Liberal Party. Here's what we know has happened. 10 days before the election call, Michael Kirby went to see John Turner in his Parliament Hill office. Kirby told Turner that private polling showed the Tories, with at least 155 seats, a clear majority going into the campaign, and one of the Liberals' biggest problems was the image of their leader. Kirby did not ask Turner to quit. He just laid out the facts. Turner's next visitor was more blunt. During a meeting punctuated with shouting, Raymond Garneau, the party's Quebec lieutenant, told Turner he must quit, that the future of the Liberal Party was at stake. But Turner said no, this was his campaign. Only Martin Goldfarb, the Liberal pollster, had good news going into the campaign. Goldfarb told Turner the election was still up for grabs. But by day 10 of the campaign, after a few campaign fumbles, even Goldfarb was telling Turner all was lost. The Tories were sweeping, and a halo of victory hovered over Brian Mulroney, a halo too firm to be knocked off. And while all this was going on, Turner was in agonizing physical pain. He'd pinched a nerve in his back, could barely walk, could barely stand up for speeches. In Toronto, just hours before this huge Liberal fundraiser, Turner was with his doctor, trying to find some relief for the pain. He told friends he was worried about simply making it through the campaign on physical grounds. It was the following night, last Thursday, that the 4 top Liberal strategists met to file their campaign assessment and talk about asking Turner to leave.
But late this afternoon, there were dramatic changes in this story. Liberals at all levels seemed to realize that they were heading towards a major confrontation and that the party in the process was only destroying itself. The strategists with Turner and those back in Ottawa have decided to have a special meeting on Friday to try and sort out the differences between them. And the candidates have backed off on their request for a meeting with Turner, convinced that Turner has no intention of stepping down. But they are not happy. They're not happy with the treatment they've been getting. They're not happy with the lack of consultation on major new policies like abortion. But mostly they're not happy with the performance of their party or their leader, now almost halfway through the election campaign. Peter Mansbridge, CBC News, Toronto.
As soon as the National was seen in Eastern Canada tonight, Turner's campaign people in Vancouver knew about the contents of our report. After a Liberal fundraiser, Turner told reporters our story was nonsense.
As I say, it is a lot of nonsense. Now I'm going to go back and meet some real people.
I mean, the perception of this happening cannot be helping your campaign.
I want to tell you something, Mr. Dino. I've been dealing with reality. People in here are dealing with reality.
How does this make you feel? How does it make you feel during this campaign? You must be getting pretty
I would think the country, as I said today, wants to start to deal with the issues.
What is your party going to start dealing with the issues? Thank you very much.
There was no comment in our report from Liberal Party headquarters in Ottawa. Peter Connolly, Turner's principal secretary, called the National's report preposterous. CBC News stands by its story.
Coming up on The Journal.
Their last gasp. Time is running out on 3 whales trapped in the Arctic ice, and the whole world is pulling for their rescue. And on the diary, would you believe Beethoven's 10th? The old master had the plan for one last piece, and now with a few finishing touches, it's music to our ears. Those stories later on The Journal.
A total of 164 people were killed in 2 separate air crashes in India today. An Indian Airlines Boeing 737 crashed in dense fog as it approached the western city of Ahmedabad. 130 people died. Just 2 hours later, also in bad weather, a Fokker Friendship airplane crashed as it prepared to land after a short 120-kilometer flight in the northern state of Assam. All 35 people on board died. The charred remains of the Indian Airlines flight were scattered on the ground near the airport in Ahmedabad. The plane exploded and burned. 5 people are in hospital suffering from burns. They're all expected to live. A suicide attack today on an Israeli army convoy in southern Lebanon. A Muslim guerrilla drove a car carrying about 150 kilograms of explosives straight into the convoy. At least 7 Israeli soldiers were killed. 10 other people were wounded. It happened just a few meters from the Israeli border as the soldiers were heading home. In Beirut, a pro-Iranian group called Islamic Resistance claimed responsibility. More from our Middle East correspondent, Jean-Francois Lepine.
It was the bloodiest attack so far this year against Israeli troops, and it took place right in the middle of the day, less than half a kilometer away from a border gate normally used by Lebanese working in Israel. Army sources say a car loaded with explosives charged into a passing Israeli military convoy. A minibus packed with soldiers was hit first. The car blew up. The impact left a huge hole in the ground and death and destruction all around it. The tragedy was not reported until late in the evening in Israel because of government censorship. But Israeli commanders in the region were talking, and they couldn't explain how it happened.
We don't know yet exactly how the car arrived, if the car came from inside the security zone or from outside the security zone.
Many Israelis question the ability of the military to secure the area, but politicians who agreed to comment tonight talked of retaliation.
What's happened is a proof that those extreme parties in Lebanon are trying to make trouble. They should be revenged.
Neither Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir nor Foreign Minister Shimon Peres, the two main contenders in the coming election, rushed to comment in details on the tragedy. Israeli politicians are cautious these days. The security of the country is the main issue in the current election campaign, and Israeli voters will judge with increased scrutiny any official step taken after today's renewed violence. Jean-François Lépine, CBC News, Jerusalem.
A dramatic challenge today in South Africa. 3 anti-apartheid leaders emerged from 36 days of refuge in the U.S. consulate in Johannesburg. The 3 activists had slipped a police guard and fled to the consulate on September the 13th. They were among an estimated 30,000 people detained without trial under the 28-month-old state of emergency. Jubilation greeted the 3 leaders as they left the U.S. consulate. Police there were watching, but they were under orders not to arrest the men. Later at a news conference, the 3 activists made it clear they plan to test their freedom by speaking out publicly. In Britain, the government has imposed a ban on all broadcast interviews with people who advocate violence in Northern Ireland. Among those now banned from radio and television, the Irish Republican Army and the Ulster Defence Association. The government says it had to stop giving a platform to terrorists, but critics are calling it counterproductive and an erosion of civil rights. A major shakeup has begun in the leadership of Yugoslavia. The Communist Party has fired 1 member of the ruling Politburo and accepted the resignation of 4 others. And there are plans to replace about 1/3 of the Central Committee over the next few months. The changes come at the end of an emergency meeting of the party as Yugoslavia's leaders try to deal with a massive economic and ethnic crisis. Patrick Brown reports from Belgrade on the winners and the losers in today's shakeup.
The late Josip Tito was the winner in today's Central Committee vote. In 1974, he wrote a constitution intended to prevent any partner in the federation from dominating the others, and it worked with a vengeance. The Serbian leader, Slobodan Milosevic, had come here with a list of demands. Propelled by the force of Serbian public opinion, expressed in massive street demonstrations in recent weeks, he believed he could force the other republics and provinces to give in. Serbia was to regain control of the largely Albanian province of Kosovo, to protect the Serbian minority there, and incompetent heads were to roll in the name of economic reform. But when it came to a vote of confidence in members of the ruling Politburo, only 1 member failed to win enough votes, and that was Milosevic's ally. But because the republics have so much power in the Yugoslav Federation, Milosevic's own position is secure.
Of course he's going to be around because his future depends on the Serbians, and he's a man who has a great support from the Serbians. He's incredibly popular. It's true that he is the most popular man in Serbia after Tito's death.
There will be moves to satisfy Serbia's demands and reform the economy, but they won't be as precipitate and dramatic as Milosevic hoped. A huge demonstration planned for Saturday has been officially postponed, but it's possible that Serbians, having had a taste of what demonstrations can do, may take to the streets anyway. Patrick Brown, CBC News, Belgrade.
The Lubicon Indians got a boost today in their land claim protest. 13 chiefs from other bands have agreed to replace Lubicon on their blockade if the RCMP make arrests. Since Saturday, the Lubicon have blockaded roads around Little Buffalo in northern Alberta. But Alberta Premier Don Getty has said he will not let the Lubicon go on breaking the law indefinitely. Getty says his government does have a contingency plan. There was a near riot today when 150 protesters stormed into the Ontario Legislative Building. The protesters were injured workers, angry over proposed changes in workers' compensation benefits. They became even angrier when they were told there were too many of them to get passes into the public gallery. They crowded into the corridors as 25 guards tried to keep them from bursting into the legislative chamber. In the end, the provincial NDP leader came out and managed to calm things down.
Pacifico, pacifico, pacificamente.
Later, the Liberal government's Labour Minister agreed to hold public hearings on changes to workers' compensation before the bill gets its final reading. It was 1 year ago today, Black Monday, October the 19th, the day the stock market crashed. Fortunes were lost that day, and predictions that the worst was yet to come. But so far, that just hasn't happened. Still, investors are skittish, and nowhere is that more true than on the Vancouver market. Ian Hanomansing reports.
While many stock markets have been slowly recovering from last year's crash, the Vancouver Stock Exchange is still reeling. The exchange index, which is a barometer of its strength, has been dropping dramatically, from more than 1,300 points early last year to just 833 points today. Stockbrokers say some clients who used to invest in the Vancouver Exchange just aren't interested anymore.
It's been fun, it's been terrific over the last few years. It has been rewarding for some if you haven't been too greedy, but the game isn't being played now. So people are saying, get me out of this game and let's try something else.
The investors in Vancouver have suffered. The liquidity's gone out of our market here. New York hasn't been that bad. Toronto hasn't been that bad.
Analysts say part of the reason the Vancouver Exchange is suffering is because of the nature of most of the stocks listed here. Lots of new small companies that are, at best, highly speculative.
I think in general, individual investors have a heightened sensitivity to risk since last year. So anything that appears risky in their eyes is something that they shy away from more than they did before. And that particularly affects an exchange like the VSE.
But the stock market has also been plagued by scandals, rocked by criticism. VSE executives admit they'll have to work very hard to rebuild investor confidence.
Our job, too, is to get the message out there that this is a fair exchange, it's well run, and there are a lot of many successful stories.
The exchange is about to start a public relations campaign. The goal is to lure back investors and finally shake the effects of last year's crash. Ian Hanomansing, CBC News, Vancouver.
And that's the National for Wednesday, October the 19th. For CBC News, I'm Sheldon Turcott. Stay with us now for the Journal.